The pandemic has created an unusual situation. Before everyone and everything was forced into lockdown, the bootstrap argument was actually a reasonable one. A poor kid, even in the United States, could conceivably work hard, graduate from high school, get a student loan, get an education in a lucrative field, pay that loan off, and wait until they're in a stable, long-term relationship before they have kids. I'm not saying it's easy or fun, or that everybody would have chosen to do it. What I am saying is that for those who did choose to do it, inevitably they saw their lives improve. But the pandemic has temporarily thrown that entire path forward out the window. Schools are closed or operating at reduced capacities. Education, and for some, graduation, has been put off. Businesses aren't allowed to function per usual. Some businesses are downsizing or closing entirely. Telling somebody to just get a job, Borisenko style, made sense before the government forcibly closed the doors of every small business and placed extreme restrictions on larger businesses and how they operate. I'm not here to talk about whether or not those restrictions are correct. That's a topic for a separate video. But even if you are a diehard believer that every single thing the state has done was not only justified but necessary, you cannot deny the massive economic damage. The socialists are pointing at the lockdowns and laughing about how capitalism just doesn't work. And to them, I would simply remind them of the old adage. Capitalism occasionally has breadlines, socialism occasionally has bread. But all of this has a cascading effect, which brings us to the topic of today's video, the landlord. If you somehow don't know what we're talking about, a landlord is somebody who rents out property for other people to live in, and collects rent for the service of doing so. The tenant's responsibilities are, generally, to pay the rent on time and not destroy the place, while the landlord's responsibilities are, generally, to make sure repairs and maintenance are completed. There may be extra responsibilities that the parties consent to in a lease, but this is still the basic idea. Of course, you can always have shitty landlords who refuse to do any maintenance or treat their tenants like garbage, and you can also always have shitty tenants who destroy the property and refuse to pay. There's bad people everywhere, but the communist left has always vilified landlords. I understood their position back during the era of serfdom because owning other humans is always evil no matter who's doing it. But times have changed and so has their logic. Now it's because they believe that being a landlord isn't a real job and that whoever lives in a house should simply own it. Or sometimes they believe that houses should be communal property. It changes depends on which specific commie you're talking to. But their criticism is the same. The landlord shouldn't own a house he doesn't live in, even though he paid for it. I'm sure if you're a reasonable person, you can see exactly what kind of problems might arise when you have a shitty landlord or a shitty tenant. And I am very happy to live in a country where there's a legal framework in place to deal with those situations. If your country doesn't have that kind of a framework, I would probably be an advocate for its creation. But let's discuss a situation where the landlord is good, the tenant is good, and everybody is generally happy. For those who can't afford their own house, a landlord provides a valuable service. A place to live that's quite cheap compared to buying a house and paying a mortgage in the same area. But even those who can afford their own house will often choose to rent because it may simply be easier to have a landlord deal with all of the repairs and maintenance and taxes and other red tape that comes with property ownership, especially if that tenant does a lot of traveling. Here's my living situation. My landlord is a working class guy who scraped enough money together in order to buy a second house. He's always here to fix problems whenever I need him, and I have no complaints. I didn't pay for this house. I don't do any of the maintenance on it. I shouldn't own it. In this situation, being a landlord is actually a real job, because it does actually provide a real service. The socialist's reply is always that a sufficiently rich landlord can simply hire repairmen and lawyers and whoever else to do all of the jobs that a landlord might do, and then the landlord can simply sit back and take rent. Yeah, fair enough, but a landlord can't hire somebody to take on the risk of the venture. If a landlord buys an apartment building for a couple $1 million, and then a fire burns it down the next day, not only is he down a couple of $1 million, he may be on the hook for the cost of all of his tenants' property if it turns out he's liable for the fire. What socialists don't understand is, taking on the risk of funding a venture is worthy enough of receiving a share of the venture's profits. Because otherwise, who would invest in anything? So yes, being a landlord is legitimate. But like I said at the start of the video, we live in interesting times, and the lockdown has created a unique situation. Within a normal capitalist economy, the higher the velocity of money, the wealthier everyone is. Let me explain. Let's say you work at a job and you get $50 for that day's work. You take your $50 to a restaurant and you have a big meal. The restaurant owner takes that $50 and buys produce from a local grocer in order to restock his restaurant. The local grocer takes the $50 and buys, let's say, window glass to repair a broken store window. And then the glazier, not needing anything at the moment, puts that $50 into the bank. In this tiny economy, even though it was the same $50 the whole way through, $200 worth of labor was performed as it was passed around, and more people's lives were impacted in a positive manner. The velocity of that $50 was therefore $200. However, if times are tough, you might just take that $50 from your job and save it. The restaurant doesn't get its produce, the grocer doesn't get his glass, and the glazier doesn't save anything. In this instance, the velocity of that $50 was only $50, and only you benefit from it. I'm not saying that's bad. Saving is a reasonable thing to do, obviously. But if an economic situation is so bad that everybody saves, then that causes the economy to crash even further. It's a spiral downward. And when there's a blockage in the pipe somewhere, it can cause a real problem. Let's say you're older, you own a house, and you're downsizing to a smaller house now that all of your kids have moved out. You've put in an offer on the house that you want, but it's dependent on you finding a buyer for your house in order to free up the money to make the purchase. And then you suddenly find a buyer, but that person's only going to have the money to buy your house if he manages to sell his house to somebody else. You can see how this situation can chain backwards indefinitely, such that everybody is willing to make purchases and has the assets to do so, but nobody actually can. This is why mortgages and loans are important, and taking on the risk that your client may not be able to pay back the money they borrowed from you is why interest payments are legitimate. Because the service of lending is what creates enough liquid capital to keep everyone's transactions flowing. And it's reasonable to expect a return for providing that service. Just like it's reasonable to expect a return for investing in a workplace and creating jobs that may not have been there. Or, yes, for providing the service of renting a house. Again, the socialist objection to this is that risk shouldn't be considered in the equation. That if you invest $100,000 into a venture, you shouldn't get more than $100,000 back out of it. Of course, this means nobody would invest. There'd be no point in it. But in my talks with various socialists online regarding what they think would happen if a business fails, their answer is inevitably that under socialism, businesses would never fail. So there is no risk, and therefore risk should not be considered. No, we're not dealing with very smart people here. But if it sounds like I've gone off track, I actually haven't. This backup in the pipes of capitalism, with all the houses being sold, the velocity of money slowing to zero, the lockdowns have made this phenomenon happen everywhere. Let's say your job closed its doors, and you can't work right now. You're not making any money, you can't pay your rent. Your landlord's asking for their money, and you're screwed. Of course you'd be angry. It's not your fault you can't pay your rent. You're not some ideological communist who wants to string landlords up in the street. You'd pay it happily if you were allowed to work, but you're not. Now, let's say your landlord is like mine, a working class guy who saved up enough money to put a down payment on a second house. He does all the maintenance himself. He treats his tenants right, but he has a mortgage to pay. He has property taxes. He has repair costs. He understands that his tenants can't pay him right now, but he has his own bills coming in. Again, I'm lucky to live in a country where all the major banks are putting a temporary halt on loan payments and interest and stuff like that. They're basically agreeing to absorb the loss and stabilize the chain, knowing that if they didn't, they still wouldn't be getting their money, and a lot of other people would be suffering far worse for basically no reason. And if you live in a country where that's not happening, I can see why you'd be absolutely outraged. But the problem is not, and has never been, rent-seeking. It's entirely the fault of the unusual situation we find ourselves in, and partially of the government for letting it happen. Consider that phrase, rent-seeking. It means to increase one's share of the total existing wealth without creating new wealth. The socialist conception of wealth is that it's finite. There's only so much of it, and that every bit of wealth a billionaire has is taken directly from the poor and vice versa. Again, this idea is stupid because you have to ask the question, where did all the wealth come from? How wealthy was humanity 100,000 years ago? No, very clearly wealth can be created. Very clearly you can take something, apply labor to it, and create a product that is more than the sum of its parts, and that is worth more than the materials used to make it. But is there really a way to perform labor that is not explicitly destructive or counterproductive, and yet still increase your share of total existing wealth without creating new wealth? Is that possible? Consider Arthur Chu's baby-brained take here. There were no bigger rent seekers than millennials burning CDs in our spare time for like 5 cents and then selling them for $10 to clueless parents who thought we were doing something really clever and hard. Yeah, I remember those days. I did it with anime DVDs, actually. I made some pretty good money off it when I was a kid. But Arthur's wrong here. Yes, the amount of actual labor and expenses required, downloading the song off Napster, burning a blank CD, whatever, it was quite low for what you got out of it. But what Arthur is not taking into account is that knowledge, and the effort to obtain knowledge, is also labor that needs to be considered. Arthur, you are a winner at Jeopardy. You think you would have figured this out by now. But older people paid kids to burn CDs for them because the effort it would take an older person with zero tech literacy to learn how to use a computer, use Napster, how to burn a CD, for some of them it was just worth paying the kids some money. Convenience is a legitimate service, and putting to use knowledge or skills that you have that somebody else lacks is legitimate labor. To consider that rent-seeking would basically be invalidating the idea that you can increase your value on the job market by learning more skills and selling your labor at a higher price, because you can now do more stuff than your competition. You know, on second thought, that actually sounds like what a socialist would say. To seek rent, fundamentally, is to receive a permanent commodity in exchange for a temporary one. And what makes that transaction balanced is that it's a lot cheaper than it would normally be. Renting a game for a weekend from Blockbuster was a few bucks, back when games range between $40 to $100 to buy yourself. Rent is often 3 to 4 figures a month, while buying a house often costs 6 or 7 figures. A Netflix subscription is cheaper than buying a Blu-ray of every movie and show you've ever watched on the service. Charging people for your work because you know how to do something that they can't or won't do themselves is probably the most common form of employment out there. Nobody who's honest thinks this is an illegitimate business model. Probably the biggest kicker, though, is the hypocrisy. Okay, there's a pandemic on, nobody can work. There should be a short-term bailout for people who can't pay rent. Fair enough. Does the radical left advocate for a short-term bailout of landlords as well? Of course not, they're part of the evil landowning class, despite landlords ranging from the ultra-rich billionaire property moguls down to the working man who lives in the community, has roots in that community, who managed to work hard and buy a second piece of property, and is likely just as vulnerable as the renters who need bailing out. What happens when all of those small landlords can't pay their bills? Suddenly, there's for sale signs on their property. And during a pandemic, when everyone's selling, when small businessmen can't afford to buy, when prices are plummeting, who do you think's going to be the one buying up all those rental properties? It's going to be those billionaire property moguls that the left hates. People who likely do not live in the community, have no roots in the community, and do not give a shit about the tenants or what's happening to them. Do not give a shit about the tenants or what's happening. The lockdown has slowed the velocity of the working class's money to a crawl. Meanwhile, the rich have been able to entirely absorb that hit and velocity drop and keep accumulating wealth at an even greater degree than before. With every local store closed, is it any surprise that Amazon is booming? I keep hearing that these temporary pandemic measures are a taste of socialism, that there's free money coming in every month, and that we should keep the system up even after the pandemic is over. But considering that this is also the system that has accelerated the bankruptcy of the middle class and enriched the wealthiest class at a rate we haven't ever seen in my lifetime, I would say no, let's not keep this up. However, I would also agree, this is socialism. Despite socialism's stated goals, it widens the gap between the elites and the plebs at a much faster rate than capitalism does, and it is significantly more destructive in doing so. The irrational hatred of landlords within the regressive left has many roots, and intersects with just as many other issues. And I understand their criticisms, I agree, they're valid. But just as it is with all other socialist ideas, their solutions are exacerbating the problem, not solving it. And it seems to me that they're just too hypocritical to admit it.